Hey everybody, it's Krista. This is Bad at Keeping Secrets, and I am super excited today to have Pooja Lakshmin here today talking about. She's an amazing psychiatrist, and I kind of want you to go over. I don't want to stop here at this moment about the difference between psychiatry and psychology. I feel like I still get asked that because I see a psychiatrist every week, and everybody asks that, but I feel like just a general understanding of terms. But you recently wrote Real Self-Care. You also have your own practice, and you also are you the founder or the co-founder of Gemma?
I am. I'm the founder and CEO of Gemma. Yep.
Amazing. And I'm going to have you talk about Gemma later, and then we're also going to talk about your Substack. But I was really excited about Real Self-Care in for lots of like personal reasons, as someone who will go into terms of what faux self-care is and what real self-care is and why you wrote the book. But for me, this is really complicated because I am a small business owner who makes things that are within the realm of faux self-care. And well, I mean, I think it all depends on framing and intention and finding one's principles and finding alignments in there. And so I think it was a really challenging, it was a challenging read in trying to figure out to be self-critical and self-aware, and also wanting to stand by this idea of wanting to do right, or do what you feel is right. So thank you so much for writing this. And maybe we should start off with how you kind of got to the story in the beginning of the book about joining a cult. I think is pretty rad and fascinating. And maybe could we start there on how you got into kind of this arena?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first I'll just say it's so exciting to be here with you, and thank you for having me. And maybe before I talk about the cult thing, I feel compelled to alleviate any guilt that you're having about faux self-care, because part of my whole framework is that it's not that any one thing is bad or wrong. It's all about how you're getting to the thing and the process that you take to get there. So, sometimes when I'm giving talks, or when I'm even when I'm talking to patients, people will be like, but I really love my lavender face cream that costs $50, and I know it's like faux self-care, but I really love it. And it's like, I'm not trying to like snatch those things away from you. If you know how you're using it and you're not expecting it to change your whole life and fix all your problems, but you're coming to it for a specific reason and a specific purpose, then that's okay, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
I think you do a really good job. I feel like earlier in the book you talk about like having a yoga practice.
Right,
One of
right. And the different ways that you can use yoga and come to yoga, and the person who's in a yoga class and it's really performative, or they're quite self-critical, like they spend the whole time worrying that they can't do a headstand, or they can't do, for example, me, I can't do crow pose anymore. I used to be able to do crow pose when I was like in my early 30s. Now, after having a baby, I can't do crow pose. Oh my gosh, I'm terrible. Or you in yoga and you're like fully present and you're practicing compassion in the way that you talk to yourself, and you understand why it's aligned with your values, and you've set boundaries to be there once a week, right? That's a very different yoga experience. So
you kind of
interesting, kind of like one of the things that I've been that has come through on the book launch, it's like this interesting process launching a book, because it's like you write the book, it takes like 2 years to write the book, and then you go out and you're talking about it, and as you're talking about it on a book launch, a whole new version sort of comes out, because you start to consolidate and understand how people are engaging with it. And before the launch, it was only you in your head. So anyway, what's coming out now is I'm understanding that you can apply real self-care to your wellness practice. Like that's sort of like a whole nother lane of the framework of real self-care, of looking at what your quote unquote wellness activity is, and then bringing boundaries, bringing compassion, bringing your values and power to that wellness practice.
okay.
But anyway, back to the cults. As you can tell, I'm someone who gets off on tangents.
Oh, well, this is going to be really tangential because I'm also a tangential thinker, as you will also find out. Because this one, the several question, I feel like before we go any further, potentially we should define what real self-care is and what faux self-care is, just so when we use the terms, we're kind of like all on the same page.
Yeah, absolutely. So faux self-care is anything that you buy or do in the service of getting relief or escape from stress, anxiety, burnout, whatever we're calling it. And that's a big category of stuff, right? That's like the juice cleanse, that's the yoga class, that's the essential oils, that's the crystals. The key is that it's like a consumer version of self-care. It's something that is outside of you, right? And it's also prescribed from either social media, other experts, right? It's like reading the women's magazines that says like, well, have you tried making a gratitude list, right? And you reading that or hearing that on a podcast and then saying, okay, I need to do that now. Let me do that. And I call that faux self-care not because it's bad or wrong. I call it faux because it's coming from the outside. Whereas real self-care is always going to be something that only you know. Like you're the only one that knows whether yoga is something that actually really helps you and makes you feel closer to yourself, or if you're just going to yoga because you think you're supposed to go to yoga, right? Like you're the only one that knows the answer to that. So real self-care, and I lay out 4 principles for how to get there, and we can talk about that. But real self-care is always going to be internally based as opposed to externally based. The other really big distinction is that faux self-care does nothing to shift the systems of power in your own life. So faux self-care will always kind of keep the status quo going.
I think you have a bit in the book about just treading water. And I feel like for some reason I just like go back to that like image
right
over and over again with faux self-care.
Right. Well, and I think like a nice example of that is like, okay, you finally clear your schedule so that you can go get a massage, right? One afternoon. But you get to the massage and you dropped like $200 or something on this massage, right? It's really expensive. And then you get there and then you spend the whole time worrying about your to-do list. And then, 20 minutes in, you spend the whole time worrying like, oh my gosh, the massage is almost over. Like I've wasted this period of time. And then you get back to your desk afterwards and you have like 50 emails that you haven't responded to, and you feel like you have to make up for that lost productivity, right? So again, it hasn't done anything to change how you think about your responsibilities, how you think about division of labor in your household, how you think about what is reasonable for you to accomplish in a day, right? All those deeper questions are sort of ignored, and it's kind of just like, oh, I'm going to go do this thing and that's going to solve my problem, but then I'm going to come back into my life and expecting that things will change. Whereas real self-care, because it's internal and because it's based on these internal psychological principles, it's always going to shift the dynamics in your relationships, which then has the power to shift larger systems.
I think that's the part that I feel like we're in this like pretty exciting moment where we're acknowledging that not every system works for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And then it seems to me the really important thing is figuring out what your values are and what systems are that work for you, and having not faith is kind of a weird word, but confidence. And I think you really do an amazing job of breaking it down later in the book. I was wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit about the history of the term self-care and kind of the origins of our understandings of it and how it's kind of evolved to where we're at.
Yeah, this was a really fun part of writing Real Self-Care for me, because I got a chance to kind of dive deeper into the history and sort of some of the academic literature. And it's really interesting. There's kind of 2 lineages when it comes to the term. So there is a medical origin. So actually in the 1950s, 60s, psychiatrists were using the term self-care to refer to things like exercise and diet, for patients that were on locked psychiatric units as a way to empower patients who didn't have a lot of autonomy, but could make discrete choices about, what clothes they picked out, what they ate, things like that. And then the nursing profession started, the term self-care started to show up in nursing literature in relation to compassion fatigue and how healthcare workers needed to practice self-care to cope with the demands of working in a clinical field. Then kind of simultaneously, self-care as a term started to show up in the Black queer feminist movement. So folks like Audre Lorde, who I think I quote like 3 times in the book, and
it's great.
books. And those thinkers were the ones who really crystallized self-care as a political movement, specifically for women of color, for Black women, and queer women, queer folks, in 1960s America, during a time where they were fighting for their rights and for their self-preservation. So, like Audre Lorde said, like self-care is self-preservation. And unfortunately, since then, we've seen self-care be co-opted by the wellness industry. And self-care now is a term that is kind of meaningless and really performative, that it's like, it's the Instagram memes, it's been commodified to be sort of really unrecognizable. Part of it I think is really, I know Jessica DeFino from the Unpublishable talks a lot about self-care, and she actually featured the book on one of her top book lists, which was awesome. And a big, peak for me during the book launch, but right. Cause there's beauty brands, right, that use the term self-care in their marketing. Right. So and my whole thing, the lens that I bring to this as a psychiatrist. So I'm a physician. I went to medical school. I trained to become a psychiatrist, and I specialize in women's mental health and see patients. And my whole kind of thing is when we place the burden on the individual to feel better. So whether we're using the term self-care, whether we're saying resilience, whatever the term is, we're completely exonerating the broken social structures that are actually causing the problem in the first place. And I wrote this book, the way that this book came about was actually because I had been writing a series of articles for the New York Times and Doximity and other kind of venues, talking about the problem with the word burnout. Yeah. Right.
Wait, sorry, can we talk about the title that kind of launched this whole thing, that we don't need care, we need boundaries?
Yes, you read that?
Sorry, I read it, you talk about it in the book.
Yeah.
And then that it was sort of an origin of how this came out of. But you were talking about, I'm interested to hear you talk more about burnout.
Yeah. So, right. So I, in 2021, I think it was, during the height of the pandemic, I wrote a piece for the New York Times, called "This is Betrayal, Not Burnout." Because when we use the term burnout, again, we place the onus of responsibility on the individual, and whether that individual is a healthcare worker who is told they need to be more efficient, or they need to be more resilient, or they need to learn how to meditate, or is my patient population, which is largely moms, who really suffered during the pandemic. You're told, well, you're burnt out, and so you should be doing self-care. You should be going to yoga. You should be meditating, right? It's like the patient who comes to me and says, Dr. Lakshmin, I'm stressed out. I'm not sleeping well. I'm not eating well. And I feel like it's my fault because I have the meditation app on my phone, and that's supposed to be the solution to my problem. But I don't want to meditate. I have no time to meditate. Right. So then you internalize it. You internalize that blame because you're burnt out, and it's your fault that you're burnt out. And so that's why I don't like the word, because it's not our fault, right? We live in a country where 30 million Americans don't have health insurance. where a quarter of American workers can't take a paid sick day.
Wait,
Where
a
if you're
quarter of Americans don't, or tell me more about that.
yeah, like a quarter of American employees don't work in for an employer that has paid sick leave for them to take.
That's not government mandated.
Well, I think it takes into account the fact that so many people are also gig workers, right? And so when we're
That
in
makes
an
sense then.
economy, right, where you're dependent on your employer to give you that protection. And if your status in the organization is as a freelancer or whatever it is, right? So yeah, so it's like these are the systems, but then why are we telling people that the solution is to do a juice cleanse or take a yoga class?
I mean, it's real, and it's hard as someone who also really likes juice. I've gotten really into smoothies lately. For a cure-all. But like,
Yeah.
when I think about these things as like larger, it is really disheartening that I'm being, as the individual, it's my problem when these things are superhumanly large issues that may it's I think the thing that I feel like your book does really well is it brings it. Can you talk a little bit about the correlation between like the things that you can do that are the power that you can find within yourself, even though it's indirectly, but it's also directly kind of working against these systems that maybe aren't serving anyone anymore.
Right. Well, and I think that's where, as a psychiatrist, that's the lane that I can help, right? Because I do think that we all know it's just, am I allowed to say shit show on this? Yeah, okay. It's a shit show. Like we all know that, right? And I think it's really easy to feel hopeless and cynical. And so with real self-care, what I'm saying is that no, there actually are principles. There are things that you can do. And so that's why I lay out the 4 principles: boundaries, compassion, values, and power. And when you start to connect with those skills and applying them to your life, then you're able to make different choices. And I know this sounds kind of abstract, so I like to give some examples of what I've seen.
Examples.
So, one of the examples that I talk about in the book is a woman who came to see me in my practice originally because she had depression and anxiety, which we got under control with medication and with therapy. And then over the course of our time working together, we started to think more about these skills, like setting boundaries, developing compassion in the way that she talked to herself. What are her values? What's really important? And one of the things that came out during that course of that time was that she had 2 kids, and she was in a cis hetero relationship, or she was married to a man, and he had never taken a paternity leave because he always worked in like small startups, and he never felt like it was going to be too much of a burden for him to step away. But when she got pregnant again, like her real self-care decision was that she was really going to speak up for herself, and she asked him if he could at least ask his employer if they would give him a paternity leave. And they might say no, right? But she wanted to know that he was going to ask. And he did. And they said yes. And that change went on to impact other people, right, that worked there and would come to work there. And that's kind of like the example of how making a personal choice and showing up differently in your relationships has the power to enact positive change on these larger systems. Like this person, my patient, like she wasn't trying to be an activist or an advocate. She was just trying to, not hate her husband, not get divorced, right? Like this was a very like selfish, personal decision. And that's real self-care, right? Again, it's like, it's you really looking at how am I spending my time? How am I spending my energy? And then what can I do to make different choices in my relationships so that I'm able to be more aligned with what's important to me and what I need.
How are
And it also, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, I feel like, I don't know if it was like maybe in the past 2 years, I feel like everyone's talking about boundaries and alignment. Um,
Mm.
and I was wondering if you could kind of unpack both of those, what they mean to you, and if you've noticed people really talking about, I mean, maybe I was just delusional before and people were talking about boundaries for all of my life, but it feels like something like, oh, the solution for all of this is you need better boundaries. I think there's like maybe a few times a month where I have to preface a conversation with, I have bad boundaries. If I say something that is not quite right with you, just let me know.
Um, it doesn't sound like you have bad boundaries, by the way.
No, I really, I work with my psychiatrist every week about, I think we've been focusing really on enmeshment. Anyway, but back to boundaries and alignment.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So I agree. I think like every therapist on Instagram is talking about boundaries. So like it's a little bit eye roll. Like it's easy to just kind of be like, geez, like what? But the reason that everybody talks about it is because if there is one psychological skill for you to master, it is boundaries. Like that's the thing. That is the thing that is underneath everything. If you don't have boundaries, then you can't do any of the other stuff. So that's why it's also principle one of real self-care. But I will say my definition of boundaries is a little bit different than what we often see. So boundaries is not having boundaries doesn't mean you're saying no. So I think of boundaries as the pause. So it's the space in between when somebody asks you something and then you decide an answer. And you could say yes, you can say no, you can negotiate. But the boundary is the pause in between. And then you have your choices. I realized this and I talked about it in Real Self-Care. It was right after I'd graduated residency. It was like 2016. And my mentor had taken me out for lunch and she gave me this piece of advice that was like shocking for me at the time. She was like, Pooja, you don't have to answer your phone. You can let it go to voicemail and then listen to what people want and then decide. And that was very much counter to like medical school doctor training where you had the pagers and you would get paged and you respond right away. And that's when it was like, oh, it's the pause. And then you have choices, yes, no, or negotiate. And the reality is because we live in a system that is inequitable, no is not always available. And no definitely comes with costs, whether it's financial costs, emotional costs, safety costs, right? So that's you have to do that calculus. You can't always say no. Like if your boss asks you for something and you say no, you might get fired, right? But the pause is always available. And then you can say, if you're in a situation where you really want to say no, but you can't because of XYZ reasons, then your work is to remember that and make a plan for, okay, 6 months from now, 1 year from now, I want to be closer to being able to say no. I want to put in place whatever my safety net needs to be, whatever like resources I need, whatever that is. I want to be closer to putting that into place so then I can get to know. And that's like, to me, that makes boundaries much more accessible, because when you tell people like just say no, everybody's like worried, right? Especially for women and women of color. The other metaphor I like to use is that healthy boundaries aren't a brick wall. Healthy boundaries are like one of those mesh trampoline nets that people have in their backyards, right? That's like flexible and things come and go, right? So you can ask, when I say negotiate, you can ask questions. Oh, like who else going to be coming to the party, right? Like what is the bed situation going to be at the lake house when we're going on vacation, right? Like just things like that, as opposed to just automatically saying yes.
I think the tricky thing for me is when I get into these situations, it's difficult for me to know where that mesh is, as you say. Like even in the pause is like this almost opening for anxious thoughts to come in, and difficulty calculating where that boundary or where the sort of, I don't know, nexus is. Do you have any sort of ways to kind of, if you are a person who maybe has a lot of anxiety, ways that you can kind of suss out. I think what I'm trying to get at is that talk about values.
Yeah, well, I would say one, you want to slow it down. Like those moments when you notice that happening, you want to like really slow it down and dial into what's happening for you in your body, you know, what type of thoughts you're experiencing, and get clear on what the patterns are there when you slow that down. And then the values piece, and you asked about alignment earlier, and I do agree. I think we hear lots of talk, especially in corporate America, about values, right? And I think it's interesting because most people don't actually know what values are or mean. Like I find in my work when I'm teaching and speaking to groups and in my practice, when I ask people about values, they'll just be like, oh, well, I value my family. And that's not helpful. Like we all value our families. Like, you know, like why, how do you value your family, right? Because a value actually is a verb or an adverb. And the thing is that the values aren't static either. So in real self-care, I have a tool called the Real Self-Care Compass, and it's like a nice little visual that's very pretty, and it helps you kind of delineate through a bunch of different exercises, like thought exercises, like naming for yourself, like what are some of my values. And it's interesting because like the words that come up are really across the board. You know, it's like I value humor, I value silliness, I value creativity, I value self-expression, I value connection, intimacy. These are right. And you know, there's so many different values words that you can choose from. So I think if you're somebody who struggles with anxiety and struggles with like doing it right, getting it right, I think working through doing some of this values work can be really helpful because it helps loosen up and remind you that there is no right answer. And it's really about you in that whatever season of life you're in, like what is coming up to the surface, and it changes. Like we were just talking right before we hit record that I'm almost 40, you just turned 40, right? Like my values now are different than my values when I was 25, when I was 30, when I was 35. And they'll continue to change and shift. And that doesn't mean that you're doing anything wrong.
It's weird how I don't know if you feel this way about your concept of self being static. But there's no reason I should feel that way because history has shown that these things change over time. I'm just curious a little bit about if you could talk. I think another thing that I feel like has been kind of like in the cultural zeitgeist of like somatic healing and getting into your body. And because I don't know, you talk about it in the book, but how do you see our relationship to our mind and body at this moment and our understanding of the interconnectedness?
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't see a difference.
I don't either.
Yeah, I mean it's all connected, and it's an artificial distinction like in medicine, and we do live in a very cognitively based society, right? So we live in a productivity oriented society that values production, which is then based on like knowledge and thinking and etc. So there's like this, and actually when I did an interview during the book launch for Anne Helen Peterson's Substack Culture Study, which I love. And she asked me about that a little bit in terms of like one of the issues with wellness and faux self-care is that we're all so focused on quick fixes, right? The idea that all of this work, whether it's getting in tune with your body, whether it's learning to be okay with setting boundaries, it's a process. It's not something that happens overnight or even in a week or in a month. It can take years. And that doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong. That is just enough. Like that's a sign that you're actually learning and integrating. And so the reason that I'm bringing this up is because I think that this disconnect that in particular Western culture has between the mind and the body is tied to things like capitalism and white supremacy and oppression and misogyny, where we've kind of internalized a very linear frame of reference for what success is and what progress is and what is like a good life, etc. And if you look at more, my family is South Asian, my parents are immigrants. If you look at kind of Eastern cultures where things are more integrated, right, there is more of this, and even just in the language, there's more of an integration between mind and body. It is sometimes easier to kind of understand why and how we trick ourselves into believing that the mind is in control of everything. I'll just say one more thing. I'm saying this also being fully like a self-described workaholic. I write in the book in Real Self-Care how hard rest is for me. I actually forgot to include rest in the book until I had a friend reading and she was like, you didn't write anything here about the body or rest. So it's hard for me. And so I'm kind of, and this is one of the things that I do, talk a lot about in Real Self-Care because of my history in the cult, is like, I'm not trying to preach from the top of the mountain. I am very much a fellow traveler learning as I go as well. And even through the book launch, I, talk about keeping secrets. I totally burnt out on my book launch. It was like drinking from a fire hose. It was exciting and it was a good problem to have so many people wanting to talk to you about your book and so many opportunities coming in. But it also, I had to relearn real self-care because it was a new season of life and a new season of my career. And I had to come back to all these principles, and I am still coming back to all these principles and relearning. And again, that's not failure. That's just how life works. It's not something that you just check off the list and now you know it and you're done and you're fine and you're perfect.
I think this is another question when you're talking about this that comes up to me, and you don't have to answer this if this is something that is not interesting to you, but how you chose psychiatry to study in terms of like the things that I'm not in the field at all. And when I think about psychiatry, I think about a specific modality for helping people feel better with medication. And I was kind of wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you see the role of medication. I think when I was reading about when in your own pregnancy, when you decided to go back on Zoloft, as someone who ever went off their Zoloft on when they got pregnant. Yeah, I'm just curious if you could talk about the role of medication.
Yeah. I'll preface by saying I've always had a love-hate relationship with psychiatry because, as we all know, psychiatry has an incredibly problematic history. And not just history, also like current. And when I went to medical school, I originally thought that I would be an OBGYN because I wanted to work with women. I was a women's studies major at Penn. But I found that I hated being in the OR and I didn't like surgery, and I wanted to talk to my patients. And I wanted to, on all my rotations, I was the one that was like asking them about their family life and like all the drama and the gossip. And, that was like, I found that to be the most interesting. Right. So I found psychiatry. I was like, oh, these are my people. But I was surprised too with how because of forces outside of medicine, how much psychiatry is like, how much injustice and oppression is also in psychiatry. And that was part of the reason why I became so disillusioned why I became so disillusioned with psychiatry and why I left for a couple years. But ultimately I came back because I saw a path for me to be a psychiatrist in the way that felt aligned with my values. And that's what I'm doing now. I see patients 2 days a week. And I do psychotherapy with my patients. I really love doing therapy. I think medications are really important. I think, like, I wrote for the New York Times that I went back on Zoloft while I was pregnant because I was high risk for postpartum depression. Medication saves lives. Medication reduces suffering, and that's real. But I have a lot more fun being a therapist. And so part of my real self-care is for how I am a psychiatrist is that I have to find joy and meaning. And in that, part of that is practicing therapy. Part of that is being a thought leader and writing and advocating. So whether it's writing a self-help book so I can help more people and kind of bring some of these ideas out, or if it's my Substack, Therapy Takeaway, and putting some of these ideas out that are prescriptive and that are aimed at kind of helping folks access some of this material and engage with it in a way that is accounting for the nuance that exists, right? Like you were saying, like, it's not just Zoloft isn't going to fix everything. There's lots of other problems. There's lots of other things. It's a one piece of the puzzle, not for everybody, but for some people, certainly. But then you also have to do this internal work. And part of that might be seeing a therapist. Part of it might be things like creating art, right? Reading the thoughts and the conceptualizations of people that you respect and admire, or being part of a community, like, or with Gemma taking classes. Like, there's just so many different avenues. And I guess this is a very long-winded way of saying, like, there's never just one thing. And I think when we like put one thing on a pedestal, that's when we lose our way. I saw that you recently had Austin Kleon on the show, and I am like a huge fan of his. I actually like totally fangirl because I'm in Austin and he is in Austin, and I totally stalked him and went to like a book signing that he was at, or book talk, and took a galley of my book up to he was so sweet. He was very sweet. But the reason that I'm thinking of this is because I think art is a big piece of it, right? Like, I think like creativity is a big piece of it, and like giving yourself space to let that be self-directed, to let it come. And that's why when I'm tying it back with faux self-care, if it's coming from the outside, you think it's a shortcut and it might work for a week or two, but it's never sustainable. It's only sustainable if it's coming from you.
I think about this a lot in terms of making, and I got this book recently. Art is the thing that no one asked you to do or like wanted you to do or whatever. And it's so weird because we live in this culture that's like absolutely undervalues that to like the nth degree. Like, if you're not selling it, if no one wants it, it's worthless.
Right.
But then being hit with this other, like, oh, well, this is actually where the meaning is located, where the like juicy stuff is coming out, where like you're channeling whatever is inside of you, and somehow wherever that comes from, whether it be like in my case, I feel like a lot of the times when I'm making things, it's channeling like a cultural consciousness or things that are going on or things that I've been exposed to. And a lot of times it's not conscious. Like, I feel like the best work comes out of unconscious. Like, when I have a conscious sort of idea in my head, oftentimes it's it's not as complicated. I was wondering if you could, so we're like totally out of time, and I feel like there were like a lot of other questions I wanted to ask you. But I selfishly also want to ask you, I think a few times you've mentioned meaning and finding meaning. And I was wondering if you could speak to where the locus of meaning is for you right now in your life.
Yeah, that's a really great question. It's actually something that I've been meditating on a lot over the past 2 months, as I've been recovering from book launch burnout, and kind of trying to figure out what's next for me.
The hard one.
Yeah, and sort of facing reality that I'm in a new stage of my career. And I like writing. I love writing, and I want to write another book. And I want to keep teaching, and I've been focusing on my how and my why, because self-expression is something that holds a lot of meaning for me. I think because of my roots of being second generation, spending a lot of time in India growing up, and just the nature of sort of like patriarchal South Asian culture, and being a girl, woman in that world, and for so much of my life not having space for that now. And when I say now, I mean over like the past 15 years, really allowing myself to own my voice. I take a lot of meaning in seeing other people understand themselves. So, and that's why I love being a therapist. So in a lot of ways, all of this work, whether it's being a therapist, whether it's founding Gemma, writing Therapy Takeaway, getting to talk to people like you, it's just another venue for getting to kind of like connect and share what I'm thinking, hear what other people are thinking, and then find a way to help each other like shift our thinking. So that's, I don't know if I even answer your question, but I think like that's where like the juice is for me. And that's generative, and then kind of figuring out, okay, what's the form then? And it's kind of like the same thing, but just lots of different forms.
I think as a person who's like constantly trying to locate the root of meaning and purpose, which I'm sure you do too, and realizing that everything feels like constructed in a lot of ways. I think it's fascinating to find out, I mean, what motivates and drives us to keep going. I really want to thank you, because we totally ran out of time, and there's like so much more in the book. So people are, I'm gonna link your book to get your book and your website, and then also your Substack is we both have them. I think you close the book too with the purpose of real self-care, and I think it's something along the lines of holding hope and pain together. And I think throughout the last like few years, it's been really, I don't know, at least for me, a challenge to muster the hope to continue along with acknowledging and the magnitude of the like fucked we are as a species, or so it seems.
Yeah.
And I love real self-care. I think it's a really important addition to talking about how humanity works and what we owe ourselves. So thank you, Pooja, for doing this. I also realize that it's a big amount of your time to take this time to share with me. So thank you.
Oh, it was such a pleasure. Thank you so much, Carissa. And that gosh, that means so much to me, and it's felt. So thank you.
Take good care.